Presented by Cursed by the Witch. Warning, use headphones before listening to horror podcast story.
The Hollow-Eyed Man is a deeply unsettling horror story that explores themes of fear, madness, and the malevolent power of an entity that preys on the vulnerable. The story follows David, a man whose life spirals into darkness after repeated sightings of a strange figure, a man with hollow, empty eye sockets who seems to appear only to those who are alone or on the brink of despair. The more David learns about this entity, the more he realizes that the Hollow-Eyed Man is not just a figment of his imagination, but a real, sinister force that seeks to consume those who fall under his gaze. The atmosphere of the story is drenched in paranoia, dread, and the creeping terror of being watched by something that should not exist. Part 8. The First Sightings. The story opens with David, a young office worker in a city that feels overwhelmingly large and impersonal. Recently, he's been struggling with feelings of isolation, made worse by a series of personal losses. His fiancée, Rachel, has left him after years of a strained relationship, and his job has become a monotonous grind. His only real friend, Ben, has noticed David's slow descent into depression, but his attempts to pull him out of it have been unsuccessful. One late night, after another long and exhausting day at work, David notices something odd on his walk home. He passes an alleyway and, out of the corner of his eye, he sees a man standing completely still in the shadows. The man is dressed in tattered, dirty clothing, his face turned toward David. But what catches his attention, and freezes him in his tracks, is the man's eyes. Or rather, the lack of them. The figure has dark, hollow eye sockets, blacker than the night around them, and though David cannot see actual eyes, he feels them boring into him. There's something deeply wrong with the way the figure stands there, unmoving but watching. David feels an intense wave of fear and panic, as if the man is draining the warmth from his body just by looking at him. He quickly hurries past, his heart racing, trying to convince himself it was just a trick of the light, or his tired mind playing tricks on him. But the Hollow-Eyed Man is just the beginning. Part 2. The presence grows stronger. After the first sighting, David becomes obsessed with the strange figure. He starts seeing the Hollow-Eyed Man everywhere, standing at the end of the street, lurking in doorways, reflected in windows. But each time David tries to get a closer look, the figure vanishes, leaving only the suffocating sense of dread behind. David's mental state deteriorates. He starts sleeping poorly, waking up in cold sweats after vivid nightmares where he is being chased through dark, endless corridors by the Hollow-Eyed Man. In the dreams, the figure never runs but simply walks, slowly and silently, always catching up to him no matter how fast he runs. The closer the Hollow-Eyed Man gets in the dreams, the colder David feels, as though his very life is being drained away. His obsession with the Hollow-Eyed Man begins to affect his work and his relationships. He starts avoiding friends and family, terrified of being alone, but unable to explain why. He can't bring himself to tell anyone about the figure, fearing they will think he's losing his mind. He even considers telling Ben, but each time he tries to explain, the words fail him, and the fear swells within him again. It's not long before the sightings escalate. Now, the Hollow-Eyed Man doesn't just appear outside, he starts appearing inside David's apartment. David wakes up in the middle of the night to see the figure standing at the foot of his bed, staring at him with those hollow, gaping eyes. Paralyzed with fear, David can't move or scream. The figure stays for what feels like hours, watching, before disappearing into the shadows. Part 3. The Curse of the Hollow-Eyed Man. Desperate for answers, David starts researching urban legends and local folklore, trying to find any reference to the figure haunting him. He comes across an old myth about the hollow-eyed man, a supernatural entity that preys on people in emotional distress. According to the legend, the hollow-eyed man feeds on the fear and sorrow of those who see him, appearing only to people who are at their lowest points in life. The more someone sees him, the stronger his influence becomes, until he eventually consumes them completely, leaving nothing behind but an empty shell of their former self. The myth describes how the hollow-eyed man is not bound by physical space. He can appear in any shadow, in any reflection, and once he marks someone, there is no escaping him. His victims report feeling a coldness that grows with each sighting, as though their very soul is being siphoned away. Some disappear completely, their homes left untouched except for a strange lingering chill in the air, while others are found wandering aimlessly, their minds broken, unable to speak or comprehend the world around them. David is horrified by what he reads but also feels a strange sense of validation. He's not losing his mind, the hollow-eyed man is real. But this realization only deepens his despair. The more he learns about the entity, the more he feels its grip tightening around him. The coldness he feels after each sighting grows more intense, and the hollow-eyed man appears more frequently, often standing silently in the corners of rooms or just out of sight. Part 4. Isolation and Madness. As the hollow-eyed man's presence becomes more invasive, David's grip on reality starts to unravel. He becomes paranoid, afraid to go out in public for fear that the figure will appear in broad daylight, or worse, that others might see him too. He isolates himself in his apartment, where the walls seem to close in around him. The shadows in his home grow longer and darker, and the air becomes cold and oppressive, even in the middle of the day. David tries everything to get rid of the hollow-eyed man, burning sage, hanging protective charms, even attempting exorcisms he finds online. But nothing works. The figure continues to appear, closer each time, until David feels like he's being stalked in his own home. He starts leaving all the lights on at night, but the darkness still creeps in from the corners, and the figure still watches from the shadows. His nightmares intensify, becoming almost indistinguishable from reality. In one particularly horrific dream, David finds himself staring into a mirror, only to see the hollow-eyed man standing behind him. But when David turns around, there's no one there. As he turns back to the mirror, he realizes with terror that his own eyes have become hollow and black, just like the figure's. In the waking world, David notices his own appearance deteriorating. He becomes pale and gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes. He no longer recognizes the person staring back at him in the mirror. The hollow-eyed version of himself haunts his every reflection, even when the real hollow-eyed man is not present. His friends and co-workers become concerned, but he pushes them away, unable to explain the true horror that he's facing. Part 5. The Final Confrontation. In the story's climactic moments, David reaches the breaking point. He's barely sleeping, barely eating, and the hollow-eyed man now appears every time he closes his eyes. His apartment is filled with the suffocating cold, and the air feels heavy with the presence of the entity. David knows that he can't escape, the hollow-eyed man has marked him, and it's only a matter of time before he's consumed completely. In a final act of desperation, David decides to confront the entity directly. He sets up a circle of candles in his living room, hoping that the light will keep the darkness and the hollow-eyed man at bay. As the shadows gather around the room, David calls out to the figure, demanding to know what it wants. The hollow-eyed man steps out of the shadows, his form barely human, a void where his eyes should be. The room grows colder, and David feels his strength leaving him, as though the figure is draining his very life force. In a haunting, hollow voice, the entity speaks for the first time. You were always mine. From the moment you first saw me, you belonged to the dark. David collapses, his vision fading as the hollow-eyed man looms over him. In his final moments, he realizes the truth. The hollow-eyed man is not just an external force. It is the embodiment of his deepest fears, his darkest emotions, the emptiness he's felt all along. The entity was never truly hunting him. It was a reflection of the void within him, the hollow feeling he had been carrying for years. The lights flicker out, and the room is plunged into darkness. Part 6, The Aftermath. When Ben arrives at David's apartment a few days later, after receiving no response to his calls, he finds the door unlocked. Inside, the apartment is cold, unnaturally so. The lights are all off, and there's no sign of David. Only a strange silence lingers in the air, and the oppressive sense that something terrible has happened. As Ben searches the apartment, he finds no evidence of David, no note, no belongings missing, just the strange cold that chills him to the bone. The only thing left behind is a large mirror in David's bedroom. Ben glances into the mirror briefly, and for a fleeting moment, he thinks he sees a shadowy figure standing behind him, its eyes hollow and empty. But when he turns around, there's nothing there. Ben leaves the apartment, shaken, with the overwhelming feeling that something is watching him. Themes and atmosphere. The Hollow-Eyed Man is a slow-burning psychological horror story that builds dread through atmosphere and the gradual unraveling of its protagonist's mind. The central theme is the idea of emptiness, both literal, in the form of the hollow-eyed man's hollow eyes, and metaphorical, in David's growing sense of despair and isolation. The entity serves as a manifestation of internal fears and emotional voids, preying on those who are already broken or vulnerable. The story's cold, oppressive atmosphere mirrors David's internal descent into madness, and the hollow-eyed man's constant, silent presence creates a sense of inescapable doom. The horror lies not in jump scares or gore, but in the slow realization that there's no way out, that once the hollow-eyed man sees you, you are already lost.
Thank you for watching. Just like and subscribe.